The room went still. The laughter that had filled the studio seconds earlier froze mid-air, replaced by a stunned hush so thick it seemed to muffle the lights themselves. Sylvester Stallone's chair screeched across the floor as he rose, his face calm but unyielding. Across the table, Joy Behar leaned forward, her voice sharp enough to cut through the silence. "Oh, come on, Sylvester, don't tell me you can't take a joke." The audience gasped. Cameras stayed rolling. Producers waved frantically off stage. But neither of them looked away. The studio lights flared against the gloss of the table. A few nervous chuckles fluttered through the audience, trying to fill the gap between discomfort and disbelief. Stallone didn't answer. He adjusted the cuffs of his jacket, the way a fighter steadies his gloves before leaving the ring. The pause stretched long enough for every viewer at home to lean closer to their screens. Then, without another word, he turned and began walking toward the edge of the set. The click of his shoes echoed like punctuation marks on a sentence no one wanted to end. Behar called after him. Something about sensitivity, something about not living in the past. But the words dissolved into the rising murmur of the crowd. A camera followed him just long enough to catch the look on his face, not anger, not pride, just a quiet, tired certainty. And then he was gone. For a moment, no one moved. The hosts sat frozen. The audience stared at the empty chair. On social media, the clip would appear within minutes, spreading faster than any scripted moment could. Comment sections ignited. Hashtags multiplied and debates erupted from living rooms to newsrooms. But the real story, what led to that explosive moment, began long before the cameras started rolling that morning. The air inside the studio carried a different kind of charge, one that smelled less like excitement and more like setup. Producers whispered around the stage, rearranging note cards, exchanging knowing glances that spoke of a plan already in motion. The show's theme was stamped across every monitor: Hollywood's role in American politics. A harmless headline, at least on paper, but beneath the script there was bait, questions sharpened like blades, ready to draw blood from whoever sat in the chair marked guest. Sylvester Stallone arrived early, carrying the quiet dignity of a man who'd fought too many battles to be rattled by another interview. To him, this was routine, another chance to talk about legacy, hard work, maybe his upcoming film. Yet something in the air didn't feel routine at all. The producers smiled too wide. The per-show banter felt rehearsed, heavy with subtext. As he waited backstage, he caught snippets from the green room TV. Joy Behar laughing about men who can't handle a little criticism. The audience cheered. It wasn't just a show anymore. It was a cultural courtroom, and Stallone was walking straight into it. On one side stood a generation that viewed discipline and masculinity as relics of an outdated world. On the other, a man who built his life on sweat, respect, and quiet endurance, values too often mocked in a world that now rewarded noise over substance. Backstage, an assistant handed him his cue card. The question printed at the top wasn't the one his team had approved. Do you think Hollywood still needs the kind of tough guy image you built your career on? The words felt loaded. Almost smirking, he looked up, and through the curtain, the lights from the view stage flickered like an invitation and a warning all at once. He took a breath, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the glow. The applause hit him before he even reached his chair. a wall of sound masking a test he didn't know was waiting. Because just minutes later, that ambush would erupt in front of millions and change his relationship with daytime television forever. Joy Behar had made a career out of saying what others were too cautious to touch. Before the politics, before the daily headlines, she was a stand-up comic, a sharp-tongued New Yorker who built her act on timing, wit, and the thrill of discomfort. She learned early that laughter was power, and power meant never blinking first. When she joined The View, that instinct didn't soften, it sharpened. Television gave her what comedy clubs never could, a platform large enough to make her opinions impossible to ignore. To some, she was fearless. To others, she was intolerable. But to Sylvester Stallone, she was about to become a wall he couldn't ignore. In the control room, producers often joked that Joy was their ratings guarantee. Whenever she clashed with a guest, the next morning's viewership chart spiked. There was a formula: start with humor, slip into politics, then push until something cracked. The audience leaned in for the spectacle, waiting for her to land the line that would trend before noon. She wasn't cruel, she was confident. She saw herself as the voice of progress, the woman unafraid to challenge the icons who represented a fading era. Her defenders called it courage, her critics called it arrogance. Either way, Joy had mastered the art of controlled chaos. In meetings, she'd wave off caution. People don't tune in for manners, she'd say, half smiling as her co-hosts exchanged wary glances. The producers knew she meant it. When a male guest leaned too far into patriotism, masculinity, or nostalgia, Joy's eyes would flash, and the audience knew they were about to see a duel. There were moments when even the crew flinched. Once, she'd interrupted a senator mid-sentence with a quip so sharp it drew both laughter and boos. Another time, she mocked an actor for calling himself old-fashioned, only to end the segment with a shrug that said she'd won. Each incident added to her legend, each argument reinforcing her identity as the woman who wouldn't yield. And yet, beneath the confidence, there was calculation. She knew which buttons to press and how long to hold them down. Every raised eyebrow, every smirk, every offhand remark was rehearsed to feel spontaneous. To her, the show wasn't a conversation, it was theater. The audience didn't need diplomacy, they needed friction. So when Stallone's name appeared on the guest list, Joy saw opportunity. An American symbol of grit and stoicism. A man who built his persona on resilience and tradition. Sitting across from her in front of millions. It was the perfect storm, the old world and the new world colliding on Lev TV. The lights dimmed, the countdown began, and Joy adjusted her microphone. She smiled, not out of malice, but anticipation. She believed she was about to hold a mirror to America. And as the cameras rolled, Joy saw her moment. One question that would light the fuse long before the cameras, long before the fame. Sylvester Stallone's story began in a cramped apartment where dreams were as thin as the walls that barely held them. He wasn't born into Hollywood privilege. He was born into struggle, the kind that doesn't inspire headlines, only hunger. His early years were filled with rejection slips, closed doors, and the echo of casting agents who couldn't see past his slurred speech and crooked smile. He was told to quit, to find another path, to stop trying. But quitting was never in his blood. When he wrote Rocky, wasn't a screenplay, It was a declaration. He wrote his own destiny when no one else believed in him. Every page was a reflection of his own life. Every punch in that ring a metaphor for every no he'd ever endured. When studios offered to buy the script but not cast him, he refused the easy paycheck. He wasn't selling his story to someone else's face. He waited, endured, and against all logic, won. Rocky wasn't just a film. It was an anthem for anyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. Then came Rambo, another symbol, not of violence, but of endurance, loss, and moral complexity. Stallone's characters were never invincible heroes. They were wounded men who stood up one more time. That, to him, was what America meant, not perfection, but perseverance. His films gave working class people a voice, immigrants a symbol, dreamers a reason to keep moving forward. But as Hollywood evolved, so did its culture. The industry that once celebrated grit and sacrifice began worshiping irony and image. Masculinity became a punchline, sincerity a relic. The same kind of courage Stallone embodied on screen was now treated like an outdated costume. He watched as newer stars mocked the very ideals that had built the foundation beneath them. Awards shows turned into lecture halls, interviews into political minefields. And through it all, Stallone stayed quiet, preferring discipline over drama, focus over fame. He wasn't blind to change. He simply refused to bend his principles to fit it. For him, respect wasn't negotiable. You didn't need to shout to prove your strength. You just needed to show up and do the work. That belief made him an outlier in a world that rewarded outrage over effort. He stood for something older, something harder to find in an era obsessed with self-promotion. To fans, he was more than an actor. He was proof that dignity still mattered, that hard work could outlast mockery, that the American dream wasn't dead, just quieter now, buried beneath the noise. To the critics who rolled their eyes at his simplicity, he had no rebuttal. His entire life was his answer. So when Stallone walked onto The View that morning, he carried more than his fame with him. He carried every rejection letter, every sleepless night, every memory of what it took to become who he was. To him, it wasn't about politics or ego. It was about principle. So when Joy Behar smirked and asked that one question, he didn't see it as banter. He saw it as an insult to everything he'd fought for. The lights were blinding, hotter than they looked on screen. The applause faded as Joy Behar leaned forward. Her signature grin sharpened with curiosity that wasn't quite friendly. Stallone sat across from her, posture relaxed, voice low. To the casual viewer, it looked like an ordinary interview. But to anyone in the room, there was something electric under the surface. The feeling that someone had brought a match to a room full of gasoline. Behar started softly, her tone sweet as syrup. Sylvester, your movies have always been intense. Explosions, guns, all that testosterone. Do you ever regret glorifying violence in your films? Stallone didn't flinch. Violence, he said, tilting his head slightly. No, I glorify endurance. There's a difference. The audience chuckled, unsure whether to clap or wait for the punchline. Joy smirked. Endurance. That's one way to put it. Some might say it's an outdated view of heroism. Men punching their way through problems. He smiled faintly, a calm that felt almost rehearsed. Or maybe it's about getting up when life knocks you down. Some stories don't go out of style. Her eyes narrowed. So you're saying your kind of hero still belongs in today's America? With all the conversations about toxic masculinity, gender roles, you think that still inspires people? He leaned in, voice steady. I think people still need to believe they can rise. That's not toxic. That's human. The crowd clapped this time, but Joy didn't. She shifted in her chair, sensing the pushback. Well, maybe that's easy for someone who's never had to face the kind of scrutiny others do. Hollywood's been accused of sending dangerous messages about strength, about patriotism. Do you feel responsible for that? Stallone's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained even. I feel responsible for trying to tell the truth. The world isn't clean, and people don't always win. But they try. And that's the point. A ripple of applause. Cameras zoomed in. Joy wasn't finished. You talk about truth, but some people think your movies feed into a fantasy. That America's always right. That men like you get to define what's honorable. Don't you think that idea's a little outdated? He took a breath, his tone almost gentle. I think honor doesn't expire. It's not about being right. It's about standing up when it's easier to sit down. The tension thickened. The co-hosts exchanged uneasy glances. A few audience members laughed nervously, unsure if they were supposed to. Stallone's calmness wasn't defensive, it was disarming. Behar, sensing she was losing control of the rhythm, doubled down. So when people criticize your movies for promoting nationalism, for making soldiers and fighters into heroes, you don't see that as part of the problem. He shook his head. No, I see it as part of the story. You don't have to agree with the character to understand his struggle. Everyone's fighting something inside or out. Her lips pressed into a line. But don't you think that kind of thinking, that constant fight, it keeps America stuck in the past? He looked at her steadily. If the past teaches strength, maybe it's not such a bad teacher. A murmur rippled through the audience. Part admiration, part shock. The co-hosts shifted again, sensing the moment slipping out of control. Joy forced a laugh, brushing her hair back. You really think that kind of tough talk still plays in 2025? I mean, the world's changed, Sly. Don't you think it's time you did too? He paused. The silence stretched. Change isn't the same as losing yourself, he said softly. You can evolve without surrendering what made you. For a moment, the entire set seemed to hold its breath. Even Joy hesitated, but then her expression changed. That quick flash of something personal, something sharper than politics. And then, one final jab crossed the line. The words hung in the air like static, unspoken but heavy. Behar leaned forward again, voice edged with mock disbelief. Oh, come on, Sylvester. You're saying your films are some kind of moral compass? They're action flicks. Entertaining, sure. But deep down, they're just fantasy. Guns, sweat muscles, men saving the day. That's not real life. Stallone didn't answer immediately. He stared at her, calm, composed, almost detached. The silence stretched, and even the cameras seemed to hesitate, their lenses focusing tighter, as if afraid to miss what might come next. Finally, he spoke. His tone wasn't defensive. It was measured, almost sorrowful. You can mock the movies, he said quietly, but you can't mock what they mean to the people who built this country. The room stopped breathing. The audience audience froze mid-applause, caught between awe and disbelief. Rehab blinked, unsure if she'd just been outmaneuvered or misunderstood. Somewhere behind the cameras, a producer muttered, "Stay on him, stay on him." He continued, his voice deepening with conviction. Those stories, they're not about bullets or bravado. They're about the men and women who get up every morning, who work, who fail, who try again. They're about people who don't get applause, who don't get interviews, who still show up anyway. A few audience members clapped softly, and uncertain whether they were witnessing a debate or something bigger, Stallone didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm was its own kind of defiance. Behar, regaining her composure, tried to pivot. "That's a nice speech," she said, smiling tightly. "But the world's moved on from that version of America." He nodded slowly. "Maybe, but the people haven't." Another pause. Someone in the crowd murmured, "Whoa," just loud enough to be caught on mic. Then he leaned forward, elbows on the table, and spoke not to Behar, but to the camera, to the invisible millions beyond it. "I'm not ashamed of where I come from or the people who believed in me. My films, they weren't about me being a hero. They were about hope. And if hope's outdated, then maybe we've lost more than we realize." The words landed like a hammer wrapped in velvet. The studio was utterly still. Even Behar didn't reply. Her trademark smirk faltered for half a heartbeat before she caught herself, clearing her throat. The co-host to her right shifted uncomfortably, trying to change the subject, but it was too late. The moment had taken on a life of its own. A camera operator whispered to another, "This clip's going viral." He was right. In real time, phones rose from the audience, screens glowing, recording the quiet dignity unfolding on stage. Behar tried once more. "So you're walking example of old school America, huh? The kind that thinks strength solves everything." Stallone exhaled, his expression softening into something close to pity. "No," he said. "The kind that knows strength doesn't mean shouting. It means standing when you'd rather walk away." And with that, he did just that. He stood slowly, every movement deliberate. He didn't slam the chair, didn't glare, didn't perform anger for the cameras. He simply nodded to the audience, a silent thank you, and turned toward the edge of the set. The mic cable brushed lightly against his jacket as he stepped away. The audience was torn between clapping and gasping. Someone shouted his name, another began to cheer, but the sound faded into the stunned quiet he left behind. Joy Behar sat still, blinking as if trying to process what had just happened. Her co-host reached over, touching her arm, whispering something about cutting to commercial. But the control room didn't move fast enough. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of his walk, the quiet defiance, the silhouette of a man who refused to argue for his own worth. He didn't storm out in anger. He walked out in silence, and that silence was louder than any speech. When the doors closed behind him, the sound stage felt cavernous. The remaining hosts tried to recover, fumbling for words, their laughter forced and uneven. Behar attempted a joke, but it fell flat. The applause sign blinked overhead, ignored. In that space between words, something shifted. The tension of a culture, too, divided to share a table, and the echo of one man's quiet protest against the noise. But once that clip hit the internet, the real explosion began. The clip hit the internet before the credits even finished rolling. Within minutes, the moment was everywhere. Cropped, captioned, slowed down, remixed. That calm, devastating line. You can mock the movies, but you can't mock what they mean to the people who built this country. Looped across TikTok, stitched with reaction videos, flooded onto X, and flooded even faster onto YouTube. By the first hour, hashtags were already trending fast: Stalin walks, Pay-view meltdown, Faye respect Rocky, Faye Hollywood hypocrisy, realignment. The internet had found its latest cultural battlefield. To some, it was righteous vindication. Finally, one viral tweet read, "A man who doesn't apologize for believing in decency." Another post, paired with a black and white clip of Rocky, said, "This is why Stallone will always be the people's champ. Class over chaos." The replies were a storm of flags, fist emojis, and fire symbols. But not everyone cheered. Progressive circles framed it differently. Behar asked fair questions. One commentator wrote, "He just couldn't handle being challenged." Late night hosts joined in, turning the moment into easy comedy. "Apparently, Rocky couldn't go the distance with The View," joked one. The audience laughed, but not all of them smiled. The moment had already outgrown punchlines. By midday, news outlets split the event into their own narratives. Like boxing posters, stay LOVS, rash, oats, endutl to you hiasich. Others went softer. Trying to dissect it as a social study was Stallone's walkout courage or fragility. Meanwhile, the internet did what it always does. It made the moment personal. Ordinary viewers, truck drivers, single mothers, veterans, students, they flooded comment sections, recounting what the line meant to them. "My dad was a construction worker," one wrote under a viral clip. "He watched Rocky every Christmas. That scene. That's him." Someone else replied, "I grew up watching Rambo with my brothers." Stallone taught us that toughness wasn't cruelty. It was heart. Within hours, the narrative had split America down another invisible fault line. To one side, Stallone was the embodiment of quiet strength, an old school symbol of grit in an era that mocked it. To the other, he was a relic, proof that traditional heroes were out of touch in a world demanding new kinds of courage. Influences took sides. A fitness YouTuber posted, "That's what discipline looks like. No shouting, no drama, just walking away with dignity." Another creator, a feminist podcaster, countered, "Dignity, please." He walked out because he couldn't handle a woman questioning him. The dueling clips amassed millions of views, stitched together by creators hungry to stake their claim in the cultural moment. Even celebrities joined the fray. Dwayne Johnson tweeted, "Respect to Sly, class act. Always has been, always will be." Within minutes, his post had over 600,000 likes. Actor Mark Buffalo, on the other side, wrote, "Conversation means staying in the room, not walking out of it." That tweet too went viral, sparking endless threads of replies, arguments, and think pieces. Meanwhile, a grainy clip surfaced from an audience member's phone. Stallone's final glance toward the crowd before leaving the stage. Someone slowed it down, added orchestral music, and captioned it. The moment the room realized they'd underestimated him, it spread like wildfire, crossing from film circles to political feeds to motivational pages. By evening, mainstream networks were covering the fallout. Analysts debated whether this was the latest culture war moment or simply a misunderstanding magnified by social media's hunger for conflict. But what no one could deny was the resonance. Something about the exchange had struck a nerve, a deep, emotional chord that went beyond politics or celebrity gossip. Talk shows booked guests to analyze it. Radio hosts played the clip between calls from truckers, veterans, and everyday listeners. He said what we all feel. One caller said, "We're tired of being told our values don't matter anymore." But beneath the fury, the hashtags, the memes, and the endless scroll of opinions, something quieter began to take shape. Clips from Stallone's old interviews resurfaced. Moments where he'd spoken about rejection, about writing Rocky while broke, about believing in second chances. Viewers stitched those moments into tributes, framing his walkout as the modern echo of his own underdog story. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Once again, a fighter walking into a room stacked against him, and walking out undefeated, not by victory, but by conviction. And through all of it, Joy Behar stayed mostly silent. A few sources claimed she was unbothered. Others whispered that the show's producers hadn't expected the backlash. The next day's episode aired as usual, but the comment section beneath the network's upload was relentless. Thousands of comments poured in. Most said the same thing in different words. "You pushed the wrong guy." The internet had turned a 10-minute talk show segment into a modern fable about pride, dignity, and the cost of authenticity. And beneath all the noise, one message kept echoing louder than the rest. In the days that followed, the noise began to fade, but the meaning grew louder. Commentators moved on to the next scandal. But that single moment of silence, Stallone's quiet exit, lingered in the collective memory. It wasn't anger that made it powerful. It was restraint. It was the rare kind of strength that doesn't demand to be seen, only felt. As the clip continued to circulate, people began interpreting it less as a fight and more as a parable. In a world addicted to outrage, Stallone had done something radically old-fashioned. He refused to perform. He didn't shout. He didn't retaliate. He didn't turn the stage into a battlefield. He simply stood up, looked his opponent in the eye, and walked away with every ounce of his dignity intact. The internet called it the walk of respect. Commentators labeled it everything from a masterclass in composure to a throwback to when men had discipline. But for millions watching, it became something else entirely, a mirror, a reflection of every moment they'd wanted to defend themselves, to speak up, but knew deep down that silence would say it louder. Because what Stallone demonstrated wasn't weakness, it was control. True power doesn't come from dominance. It comes from the refusal to be dragged into the mud. In that sense, his exit was the final punch, the kind you never see coming, the one that leaves the crowd in stunned silence. For a generation raised on the idea that attention equals influence, his act flipped the formula. He didn't win by trending. He won by choosing peace over performance. And that decision, simple, quiet, absolute, hit harder than any scripted line could. A week later, a columnist wrote, "In a time when outrage earns applause, silence can still shake the world." The piece went viral, quoted across podcasts, stitched into TikToks, read aloud by creators who had never cared about The View before. Suddenly, Stallone wasn't just a movie legend. He was an emblem of something vanishing in public life: self-respect. Clips of his past interviews resurfaced, especially one where he'd said, "You don't have to win every argument. You just have to know who you are." That quote began appearing beneath his image, across motivational pages and Facebook posts shared by fathers, veterans, and young men trying to define strength in a culture that often mocks it. But it wasn't just men who found meaning in his stance. Many women commented that his calm walkout resonated deeply. "This is what healthy masculinity looks like," one wrote. Not aggression, not ego, just boundaries. That simple word, boundaries, began to trend alongside his name. For all the debates and divisions that followed, the moral of the moment was universal dignity is not up for debate. In every era, there comes a time when silence speaks, truth louder than argument. Stallone reminded the world that you don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to stand tall. Even as you leave the room, the image of him walking off the stage, back straight, head high, became a kind of modern myth. It was replayed in slow motion, scored with emotional music, transformed into 1,000 interpretations. But the essence remained pure. This was not a man escaping conflict. It was a man choosing peace. And maybe that's the quiet revolution we've forgotten how to admire. The ability to walk away, not out of defeat, but out of self-respect. To refuse the noise, to reclaim the narrative. To prove that composure can be more defiant than rage. Because sometimes the most powerful line isn't spoken at all. It's the one written in the pause that follows. And as the dust settled, one truth emerged above the chatter, the hashtags, and the headlines. Sylvester Stallone didn't just leave the view. He left a message, one that would outlast the applause, the anger, and the argument. But Stallone wasn't the only star to face the view's fury. What happened next with another legend shocked everyone. The music swells, low strings, cinematic, reflective. The camera pans back from the empty chair Stallone left behind. The studio lights still burning where he once sat. That silence, that walk, that look. It's become more than just a viral clip. It's a line in the sand about who we are and what we've become. Sylvester Stallone Farsighty to leave the view. The headline said it all. But the truth behind it ran deeper. He wasn't just walking out on a talk show. He was walking out on a culture of mockery, on the noise that drowns out respect, in a time when shouting is mistaken for strength. And Stallone reminded the world that real power comes from knowing when to stand and when to walk away. The story has sparked debates across dinner tables, comment sections, and newsrooms. Was Stallone right to walk away, or should he have stayed and fought? That's the question dividing millions right now. But maybe, just maybe, it's not about who won the argument. Maybe it's about what it revealed, that in a nation built on freedom, dignity is still the highest form of defiance. And so tonight, as the lights dim and the screens go dark, think about the message behind the moment. Think about what silence can mean when the world demands a roar. Because sometimes walking away isn't surrender, it's self-respect. If you believe dignity still matters in America, share this story. Let the message spread louder than the noise. Subscribe for more untold moments where character outshines chaos, where truth stands taller than talk. This isn't just about a walkout. It's about the courage to leave with grace and the strength to never look back.